The night my mother-in-law called my father the help, I was holding a glass of champagne and smiling at a room full of people I barely knew. I didn't drop the glass. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, frozen, watching my father's face go still in that way it does, when he's trying very hard not to let something hurt him. He's 61 years old. He's worked in a meatpacking plant in Sioux Falls for 32 years. His hands are rough and scarred, and he still wears the same Carhartt jacket he bought in 1998 because, in his words, it still does the job. He drove 14 hours straight from South Dakota to Atlanta for my engagement dinner. He didn't complain once. And she looked at him across that marble foyer and said quietly to one of the other women, "I thought the catering company said they'd handle the setup. Who let the help wander in through the front?" My fiancé was standing 3 feet away. He laughed at something someone else said and turned away from me. I need to back up, because this didn't start at that dinner. It started 2 years ago in a hospital waiting room in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I was sitting with my laptop open and my shoes wet from running through the rain and absolutely no interest in talking to anyone. I was 30 at the time. I'd been working remotely as a data analyst for a healthcare consulting firm for 4 years, and that year I'd been traveling constantly. Charlotte was the 3rd city in 6 weeks. I was there for a client visit, and I'd slipped on the curb outside the hospital entrance and twisted my ankle badly enough that they made me sit down and wrap it before they'd let me proceed to the 6th floor. That's when I met him. He was sitting across from me in the waiting room, dressed in a button-down that was slightly wrinkled, a coffee cup in one hand, looking at his phone with the concentrated frown of someone reading something he doesn't want to read. He noticed me wincing when I tried to shift my ankle, and without looking up, he said, "Ice machine is around the corner past the elevators. They usually leave a pitcher out." I told him I was fine. He said, "You're not, but okay." I almost laughed. His name was Liam. He was there because his younger brother had just had emergency surgery. Minor, he said, downplaying it in the way people do when they're scared and trying not to be. We talked for an hour. When they called him back, he stopped in the doorway and turned around and asked for my number. I gave it to him. I'm still not entirely sure why that surprised me, but it did. Liam Whitfield. His family had money. Serious, old Atlanta money, the kind that doesn't announce itself but is visible in every detail if you know how to look. The address. The way his mother moved through a room. The fact that his parents' casual Sunday dinners required a 3-day heads-up from the housekeeper. I knew all of this before I ever met them. Liam was straightforward about it. They have certain expectations, he told me once, early on, and I remember thinking that was a strange way to describe one's own parents. Not their traditional or their formal expectations, like they were a performance requirement rather than people. I told my mother about him after our 3rd date. She laughed and said, "As long as he treats you right, I don't care if his family has a yacht." My dad said even less. He just asked if he was a good man, and I said I thought so, and my dad nodded and went back to watching the game. That's the thing about my parents. They don't perform. Whatever they feel it quietly and honestly, and they raised me the same way. My dad packs his own lunch every day and comes home smelling like metal and cold air, and he's never once in my life made me feel like what we had wasn't enough. My mother works the early shift at a grocery distribution center. They paid off their house 2 years ago. They're the most stable, decent people I have ever known. I should have thought harder about what it would mean to bring them into a world that measures people by different math. The first time I met Liam's parents was at their home in Buckhead. 6,000 square feet, a catered Sunday brunch, 12 guests, none of whom I'd ever met. His mother, Eleanor, was gracious in the way that some wealthy women are gracious, perfectly calibrated, warmly correct, never warm enough to make you forget who's on which side of the hospitality. She asked about my work. I told her. She nodded as though I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. His father, Richard, barely spoke to me. He spoke to Liam, in that particular way fathers speak to their sons in front of their sons' girlfriends, assessing, not including. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself these were people who needed time to warm up. I told myself a lot of things that year. What I didn't let myself think too hard about was the moment, very early in that first brunch, when Eleanor looked at a photo on the mantelpiece, a family photo I'd seen Liam show me before, his parents and his brother and his grandmother at some coastal resort, and said, offhandedly, "To no one in particular, family is everything, don't you think?" At the end of the day, nothing matters except that the people around you are the right people. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She didn't have to. Liam proposed 8 months later. We were in Asheville hiking a trail we'd done twice before, and he stopped at the overlook and got down on one knee, and the ring was his grandmother's, and I cried and said yes, and for about 3 weeks I let myself believe that love was actually enough to bridge whatever gap existed between our worlds. Then we started planning the engagement dinner. Eleanor wanted to host it at their home. A Friday evening, cocktail attire, 60 guests, a catering team, a florist. She sent me a color palette. She asked for my parents' names for the place cards. I told her, Frank and Judy Marston. She said, lovely. I called my mother that night and asked her what she was planning to wear. She said she and Dad were thinking of driving up and spending the night at a Holiday Inn nearby. She'd found a nice blouse at TJ Maxx. Dad was going to wear his navy blazer. I almost said something then. I almost said, Mom, let me take you shopping. Let me get you both something new. I want you to feel comfortable. But the way she said it, so easy, so unbothered, so completely herself, I didn't want to imply that herself wasn't enough. I didn't want her to hear underneath the offer that I was ashamed, because I wasn't. I was never ashamed. I just didn't think hard enough about what was coming. They arrived at 6:45, 15 minutes before the official start time, because that's how my father is. Early is on time. On time is late. My dad in his navy blazer and his good dress shirt, the one my mother bought him for my college graduation. My mother in her new blouse, a soft blue, with the pearl earrings she's had since her own wedding day. They looked like what they were, honest, hard-working people dressed in their best, showing up with their whole hearts. I met them at the door. My mom hugged me so hard I felt my earring catch in her hair. I brought them inside. I watched in real time as the temperature of the room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. That's what I want people to understand. There was no one pointing, no audible gasp. It was subtler than that and somehow worse. It was the way the conversations nearest to the door paused half a beat when my parents walked in. It was the way Eleanor's eyes traveled from my father's jacket to his shoes and back up again. The whole survey taking less than 2 seconds, and then she smiled and said, Frank and Judy, how wonderful, please come in the same tone she'd used to welcome the valet. My father said, thank you for having us. Beautiful home. Eleanor said, of course, let me find someone to show you around. She turned to a server. She pointed at my parents. She said very quietly, could you take them to the garden table? The garden table, which was a small round table set slightly apart from the main arrangement, near the side doors to the terrace. A table with 4 chairs and no other guests assigned to it. A table that was clearly, visibly, secondary to everything else in the room. My dad followed without hesitation because he didn't know the difference and no one told him. I knew the difference. Liam was across the room talking to his father's business partner. I looked at him. He glanced over and I made a face, the kind of face that means something is wrong, and he gave me a small nod that meant we'll talk later and turned back to his conversation. Later. We'd talk about it later. I circulated. I had to. It was expected. I shook hands and answered questions about my job and made small talk about Atlanta traffic, and nobody asked about my parents, and nobody seemed to notice that the 2 people who had driven 14 hours for this dinner were sitting alone near a door that led to the backyard. At some point I went to find them. My dad had gotten himself a plate of appetizers, and he was telling my mother something that was making her smile. Probably a story about the drive, about the GPS taking them off the interstate 3 different times. He looked up when I walked over and said, Hey, Bug, this crab dip is incredible. You gotta try it. I sat with them for a few minutes. I felt the weight of the room, knowing I was at the garden table, knowing what that meant to these people, not caring even a little. Then I had to go back. I passed Eleanor on my way across the room. She was standing with 2 women I'd met briefly, friends of hers, wives of Richard's colleagues, and she was speaking just quietly enough that she probably thought I couldn't hear. Completely caught off guard, but what can you do? Liam always had such a soft spot, and they're very sweet in their way, but you can imagine. One of the women noticed me, and there was a half-second pause, and then Eleanor turned with a smile so smooth it must have taken decades to perfect. There you are, sweetheart. We were just saying how much we love your dress. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Thank you, Eleanor." And I kept walking. Here's what she didn't know. Here's what almost nobody at that party knew except Liam. And Liam knew it so completely that his choice to do nothing with that knowledge tells you everything you need to understand about who he turned out to be. 18 months before that engagement dinner, the consulting firm I worked for had been restructured. I was offered a buyout, and instead of taking it, I used a substantial portion of my savings to invest in 3 early-stage healthcare technology companies I'd been tracking for 2 years through my analytical work. I knew those markets. I understood the data better than almost anyone in the room had because of what I'd spent 4 years doing, analyzing healthcare systems, spotting inefficiencies, predicting growth patterns. One of those companies had already tripled its valuation. The other 2 were in active discussions with a regional hospital network expansion, a $40 million deal that was very close to closing. Richard Whitfield's family investment firm was one of the co-investors in that hospital network expansion. They needed the deal to go through. They had 4 other investors lined up. What they didn't have, what they were still scrambling to secure, was a minority data analytics partner to satisfy the network's due diligence requirements. A partner with verifiable expertise in healthcare market analysis and a proven stake in the sector. The firm had reached out to me, through a third party, 6 weeks before the engagement dinner. I hadn't responded yet. I had been thinking it over. By the time I sat back down next to Liam that evening and watched my father carry his plate of crab dip to a table near a back door, while Eleanor Whitfield told her friends what she could, in her way, her soft spot, you can imagine, I had stopped thinking it over. I didn't do anything that night. I want to be clear about that. I went home. I lay awake. I looked at the ceiling of Liam's apartment for a long time. I thought about my father's face. There's a specific expression he gets when something hurts him, and he's decided not to show it. His jaw goes just slightly tight. His eyes go soft in a way that doesn't match the rest of his face. He's had that expression maybe a handful of times in my life. Once when his own father died, once when we couldn't afford to fix the furnace and he made a joke about sleeping in layers. Once when I got into college and he read my acceptance letter alone at the kitchen table because he thought I wasn't home yet. He had that expression when Eleanor pointed him toward the garden table. He recovered in about 4 seconds, because that's who he is. But I saw it, and I kept seeing it, over and over in the dark. The next morning I called my mother. I told her what I'd overheard. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Honey, some people are just small. That doesn't mean you have to be." I thought about what she said for 3 days. And then I made some calls. The first was to my contact at the investment group. I told him I'd reviewed the proposal and I'd made a decision. I would not be partnering on the hospital network deal. I cited strategic misalignment. I thanked him for the opportunity. He was disappointed. He told me it would impact the due diligence timeline significantly. I told him I understood. The second call was to a colleague I'd stayed close with from my consulting days, a woman named Vera who had built an independent analytics firm out of Austin and had been looking for an opportunity to break into the Southeast healthcare market. I told her about the network expansion. I told her the due diligence window. I sent her everything she needed to make a pitch. Vera said, "Are you sure? This could have been yours." I said, "I know, but I think it suits you better right now." The third call was to Liam. I told him I needed to see him in person. He said, "Sure, tonight. What's wrong?" I said nothing was wrong. I just needed to talk. He said okay. But he heard something in my voice. I know he did, because when I arrived he was sitting very still on the couch, and he looked the way people look when they've been waiting for something they knew was coming. I sat across from him. I didn't drag it out. I said, "I've been thinking about your mother's comment about my father at the engagement dinner." He said, "I know. I'm sorry. She can be." I said, "I'm not asking for an apology for her. I'm asking about you. You were 3 feet away. I looked at you. You looked at me. And you turned around." He was quiet. I said, "I need you to understand something. My father drove 14 hours to be there. He wore the blazer he bought for my college graduation. He walked into a room where he didn't know anyone, in a house that looked nothing like anything he's ever lived in, and he found the crab dip and he told my mother a funny story and he didn't make one single person in that room feel uncomfortable. And your mother put him near the back door and called him the help, and you turned around." Liam said, "She didn't say he was the help." I said, She pointed at my parents and said, "Take them to the garden table," and then told her friends they were sweet in their way. She called him the help to two of her friends before she saw me. I heard her. The silence went on for a long time. Then Liam said, "What do you want me to do? She's my mother." I looked at him. I said, "Yeah, she is." I picked up my coat. I took the ring off. It made a small sound on the glass coffee table, just this quiet click, this small, ordinary sound that I keep coming back to, this tiny punctuation, and I walked to the door. He said my name. I turned around. I said, "I want you to know that I genuinely thought you were a good man. I think somewhere in there you might still be one, but not today." And I left. I won't pretend the next few weeks were clean or neat. They weren't. I cried more than I expected. I missed him in the specific way you miss someone you built habits with. The Sunday morning coffee, the running playlist we made together, the dumb way we argued about whether Die Hard was a Christmas movie. I grieved that. What I did not do was second-guess the decision. My mother flew down, and we spent a weekend at the coast, walking and not talking about it much. On the last morning, she made eggs in the little kitchenette of our rental, and I sat at the counter watching her, and she said, without looking up, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" She said, "The crab dip. Your dad has not stopped talking about that crab dip." I laughed until I cried. Or maybe I was already crying a little, and the laughter just joined in. Either way, 3 months later, through the industry circles that these things travel in, I heard that the hospital network deal had stalled. The due diligence requirements had not been satisfied by the replacement partner on the original timeline. 2 of the co-investors had grown nervous and begun restructuring their commitments. Richard's firm was managing it, but managing it meant renegotiating terms that had taken 2 years to build. Vera, for what it's worth, got a separate contract with the network for an independent analytics audit. She called to thank me. I told her she'd earned it. I'm not going to tell you I felt nothing when I heard about the Whitfields deal. I'm not going to perform a kind of equanimity I didn't fully have. There was a part of me that felt something sharp and settled simultaneously. The way you feel when something that needed to happen finally does. But mostly what I felt was this. My father doesn't know any of it. He knows I called off the engagement. He called me the day he found out, and I was bracing for questions, for worry, for the particular gentle pressure of a parent trying to understand what went wrong. Instead, he said, "You okay, bug?" I said, "Yeah, Dad, I really am." He said, "Okay. You want to come home this weekend? Your mother's making that soup." I said yes. I drove up on Friday. My dad was in the garage when I pulled in, working on something at the bench the way he always is, on Friday evenings. He looked up when I got out of the car and his face just opened, the way it does. Like relief and love are the same expression. He said, "There she is." I walked over and hugged him for a long time in his old Carhartt jacket that still smells like metal and cold air. And I thought about Eleanor Whitfield and her marble foyer and her garden table and her catering staff and all the maths she used to measure people. And I thought about how none of it, not one single calculation, had touched what was actually in that garage with me right then. Some things don't require an announcement. Some things you just already know. I keep coming back to that small sound. The ring hitting the glass coffee table, just a quiet click, barely anything. And yet, that's the moment I remember most clearly out of all of it. Not the engagement dinner. Not Eleanor's smile. Not Liam saying she's my mother like that was an answer to anything. Just that click. I think about what it actually took to get to that moment, and it wasn't the anger. Anger I had early. Anger came the second I watched a server point my father toward a back table and my father follow without hesitation because nobody told him he was being sorted. Anger is easy. Anger burns fast and doesn't ask hard questions. What took longer was the clarity. My father spent 32 years in a meatpacking plant. He drove 14 hours for a dinner where someone looked at his jacket and decided he didn't belong, and he found the crab dip. He made my mother laugh. He sat at that back table and was completely, entirely himself. And that's what I keep circling back to, because there is a kind of integrity in that money genuinely cannot manufacture. Eleanor Whitfield had a marble foyer, and a catering team, and a color palette for a party, and she still needed to make my father small to feel comfortable in her own home. That's not power. That's the opposite of it. I think there's something true in the way things unfolded. Not mystical, not fate, just the straightforward logic of how choices stack. Eleanor made a choice about who deserved to sit where. Liam made a choice about which direction to look. I made a choice about the phone call I would and wouldn't make. Richard's firm made a choice 2 years earlier about which deal to anchor themselves to. None of those choices existed in isolation. They all landed somewhere. What I know is that I spent 4 years building something real. Real knowledge, real relationships, real stakes in industries I understood from the inside out. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because I paid attention when it wasn't glamorous and stayed disciplined when it would have been easier not to. And when the moment came where that work had value to people who had treated my family like background furniture, I had the standing to simply say no. That's what I want people to hear, maybe. Not the revenge part, the preparation part. The years of quiet work that gave me options when options mattered. And then there's the harder thing, the thing that cost me more than the deal or the relationship, walking away from someone I had genuinely loved. That required something I'm still not sure I have a clean word for. Not toughness, exactly. More like the willingness to let a loss be a loss without rewriting it into something that wasn't true. Liam wasn't a villain. He was just a man who, when the moment came, chose what was comfortable over what was right. That's one of the quieter ways people fail each other, and it's devastating precisely because it doesn't announce itself. My dad still doesn't know the details. He knows I called it off. He asked if I was okay. I said yes, and he told me about the soup. That's the whole thing, really. That's the entire lesson. The people who drove 14 hours in a navy blazer from 1998, those are the ones still there when the marble foyer is far away and the deal is long closed and none of it matters anymore. I drove home. He looked up from the garage. He said, "There she is." That's the part I'll remember longer than any of it.